Okay, so question 4 on paper 2 then. More marks available on this one, so really important that you leave enough time for it. Um, yeah, there's 16 marks, 20 marks on paper 1, but it means that we've got to do a lot of detail and we've got to show that we've read both sources. And we're not only that, but we've got to identify how the writer has shown things. So let's have a look at the question. For this question, you need to refer to the whole of source A together with the whole of source B. Compare how the writers convey their similar perspectives on cycling in the city. So I always say to my student, yeah, that's great exammy speak. We can understand compare. Convey is just a fancy word for show. They're similar perspectives. Perspectives is a fancy word for thoughts and feelings. And then we have the focus of the question, cycling. So compare how the writers show their similar thoughts and feelings. And again, I'm just going to just similar. If, for instance, you by mistake talked about differences, you would still get credit, but it's worthwhile sticking to exactly what they want. The important bit is here, and it reminds you what you've got to do. So you've got to compare similar perspectives on cycling the city. And the really important bit is compare the methods. That's what my students often forget. And so what do we mean by methods? So that can be anything: tone, structure, language, techniques, word types. So for me, I know most of my students struggle with structure, so I would avoid that as a technique unless you're an ace at structure. But we've done language features a lot, so I think language and word types are an easy bet. And if you're confident we're talking about tone, particularly these two texts do have different tones. One's quite humorous, one's very serious. So you could talk about how the writer conveys that tone in there. But for me, I always kind of stick with language techniques and word types because that's where our confidence is in terms of methods the writers use. So support your response with relevant with references from both texts, and so we know that that's quotes. So methods and quotes. How do the writers feel? How do they show us? And then we've got to back it up with our quotes. So I think it's an always good idea to plan this question because it is quite big, and you don't want to waste your time talking uh, unnecessarily. We want to stick to what we need. So we can do it like this on our paper: source A, source B. And what we need is, if for 16 marks, I would try and get 3 quotes, 3 methods from both texts. But like I say, you've got to plan your time. And if you can manage to talk about at least one thing from both texts, check your timing, making sure you leave enough time for the writing section. Do that. Do as much as you can in the 15, 20 minutes maximum that you want to spend on this question. So for source A then, we've already started looking at it. And I would always suggest it tells us to read the whole of the source. So it's only now that we feel like maybe we should really have a good scan through and see if there's some exciting methods that the writer has used to convey their point of view. So we've already looked at how the drivers behave here. All cyclists fear bad drivers. How do they feel? Well, they use words like let's have a look. My last such incident happened just under a week ago. So he's telling a little story here. That could be classed as a method, couldn't it? We could say that's anecdotal evidence. They've used a little story to show what their experience of cycling is like. And that tells us, doesn't it, that he's found cycling very scary. What does he say? He was unharmed, but he felt like the driver was gambling with his life, which is quite dramatic, isn't it? But the fact that he tells us of incidences shows that he feels that it's dangerous on the roads. So let's have a look through and see what other language features he uses to convey his thoughts on cycling. And in fact, still in that first paragraph, we've got gambling, and he extends that kind of metaphor. It's a metaphor, isn't it? The driver was gambling. And he extends that metaphor further down, but nonetheless, very real roll of the dice with my chances of making home safely. So that's a nice thing to put in. So I'm going to put that in my little table just to check that I don't forget about it. So source A, he feels unsafe. That's his perspective. It is unsafe on the roads. So we put a little P for perspective. Then we're going to put a quote. So we've got gambling, and we've also got roll of the dice. And then our method we need to identify, and this is a metaphor. And then we would want our effect. So what does this metaphor of gambling and roll of the dice tell us about how this writer feels unsafe? So if you think about gambling, it's chance, isn't it? Luck. And you don't want to have a situation on the road, a life and death situation on the road that's down to chance or luck. So that's quite a good one. So some teachers might advise you that once you've got that information, maybe you should just go to source B and find something to compare. But we'll have a quick scan through and just see if there's anything more exciting that we could compare. Because remember, we need a couple. So a couple of things must be noted first, however distressing such incidents can be, and there is evidence they help keep levels of cycling in Britain as pathetically low as they are. Riding a bike is still safer than many people think. The average Briton would ride 2 million miles before they suffered a serious injury. So he's talking about his perspective on cycling, if it's safer than driving. And we've got a nice fact here, a statistic to back that up. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Secondly, while some are tempted to characterise such events as part of a war on the roads, it's nothing of the sort, not least as the majority of cyclists also drive and would thus be somehow waging war on themselves. Again, he's now using a metaphor, war on the roads. What does that imply? It means that he thinks that they're enemies, maybe, cars and cyclists, cars v cyclists. This metaphor, waging war on themselves. The thing to grasp is that it's about the person, not the mode of the transport that they happen to be using at that particular time. As well as cycling, I walk, use buses and trains, sometimes drive, occasionally get planes. My personality is not changed or defined by any of those. I get the sense that all these forms of transport are populated by roughly similar proportions of idiots. They might push onto a train, barge past you on an escalator on an underground station, recline their plane seat just as the meals are being served. Okay, well, that's all very nice lists and nice verbs about barging and reclining, but it's not about his perspective on cycling as such. Driving is, however, different in one way. It's the sole event in most people's everyday lives where there is a plausible chance they could kill another human being. It's not about morals, it's simple physics. If I hit someone at 12 miles per hour, even on my solid, heavy, everyday bike, it would impart something like 1,200 joules of kinetic energy. If I were in the last car I owned, a relatively tiny Nissan Micra, doing 30 miles an hour, you're suddenly at 100,000 joules. It's a very different impact. Okay, so obviously lots of facts there and quite emotive. He's talking about killing another human being, maybe the dangers of driving in comparison to cycling, and lots of numbers there to tell us. So if we've got methods here, language, I think here is where the tone is very serious, and you could talk about that as a method, and again, that facts and stats as well that the writer uses. Okay, so I think in terms of trying to manage our time, we're going to quickly look at, so we've got a couple of ideas. Let's look at this one. Is there anything here? Well, there's lots of language features in this text that we could talk about that shows the writer's perspective on cycling. So we know she's very nervous. We've already looked about how she felt her first impressions for question 2. So her perspective on cycling, let's have another look. So there's some really nice things here. She says she as nervous as a hare that feels a greyhound's breath. Lovely. Similarly there, I launched my bicycle early on Sunday morning, July, into the stormy oceans of Sloane Street. So we've got metaphor. And if we were going to compare tone, it's a lot more kind of humorous. She kind of makes a joke about being killed. Here, if he'd not tried to kill me, it'd be very nice. So she's trying to put some humor into her tone. It's much less serious and much more light-hearted here. So you could compare the language or the tone, and we've already got some good evidence for that. So it's a really good technique to not maybe have to read the whole text if you find your evidence straight away. Unfortunately, some texts, all the good stuff might be at the bottom. So I would scan the text to see what we can get. So again, we'll go just back to our planning thing. So it's really good to compare things that are similar. So if I'm going to compare the use of a metaphor in source A, it'd be nice to compare it with a metaphor in source B, but maybe with a different perspective. So the metaphor that stands out to me on source B is this stormy oceans one. So her perspective is, if she feels like she is a little person in a stormy ocean on the roads, then maybe her perspective is that she feels small and in danger on when she's cycling on the roads in London. And here's my quote: "Stormy oceans is how she describes the street." So the method there is a metaphor, so we can compare the same techniques, and the effect of that is it makes us realize her feelings is very nervous and out of her depth, maybe. Okay, so again, we could then say, all right, well, we've got to do a couple, so let's do the tone one. So in source B, the perspective is that it's all fun and exciting. And her quote there, we're in the streets, would be nicer if ... not try to kill me. Method, humor, and the effect would maybe encourage other cyclists to give it a go. She's not trying to put them off, unlike in source A, where he's quite scary statistics about death on the roads and the power at which you might be hit. So here we can say this perspective here is that much more likely to be injured by a car than a cyclist. And there's our quote. Blah, 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 blah. Let's have a look. Suddenly, in a car, doing 20 miles an hour, suddenly 100,000 joules. Method, serious tone, and effect to encourage drivers to take more care. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if you took the time to plan that, now that reading through the text and everything, that's taken me 13 minutes. So it would just now be a matter of me writing that up in full sentences. But I've got a clear points, clear quotes, comparable methods, and saying a few notes about the effect. And you would get really good marks if you were able to compare all of those things and making sure you're keeping all those things together. So again, it's up to you how much time you spend planning it or whether you want to just go straight into writing it. But I think it's worth looking through the text and finding comparable things that you can talk about, especially because it's similar. So they both use different methods to convey different perspectives on the same topic. And to make those kind of links would be really effective, and you would be getting great grades if you were managing to write all this up in about 20 minutes. So you'd have 6 minutes to write this up now, and you'd be confident that you'd hit every point that you needed to make.